The sirens pierced through the peaceful evening air like broken glass. Red and blue lights danced across the surface of my father's pond, reflecting off the water where I'd scattered his ashes just 6 months ago. I stood there, tongs in hand, watching two patrol cars barrel down my dirt driveway with enough urgency you'd think I was running a meth lab instead of grilling burgers to honor Dad's memory. "Sir, step away from the grill," Officer Martinez shouted as he emerged from his vehicle, hand hovering near his weapon. Behind him, Karen Pemberton strutted forward in her pristine white tennis outfit, her bleached hair catching the fading sunlight like a beacon of righteous indignation. "That's him. Officers. Maverick Sullivan. He's violating multiple HOA ordinances and refused to comply when I personally informed him of the infractions." I set down the tongs slowly, my hands trembling not from fear, but from pure, unadulterated rage. This woman, this self-appointed guardian of suburban perfection, had just called the police on me for barbecuing on my own property, the same property where my great-grandfather had built this ranch with his bare hands in 1952. The same pond where Dad had taught me to fish every summer until cancer stole him away. "Officers, I'm Maverick Sullivan, and this is my land. Has been in my family for 70 years. I'm not sure what ordinances Mrs. Pemberton thinks I'm violating, but I can assure you I have every right to grill on my own property." Officer Martinez looked confused, glancing between Karen and me. His partner, Officer Johnson, was already walking the perimeter, studying the landscape with the careful eye of someone who'd dealt with property disputes before. "Ma'am, what exactly is the violation here?" Karen's face flushed red, but she maintained her imperious stance. She pulled out a leather folder, thick with documents, flourishing them like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "This entire area falls under the jurisdiction of Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Mr. Sullivan is operating an outdoor cooking device without proper permits, creating smoke pollution, and disturbing the peace during restricted hours. Furthermore, his property line extends only to that fence line there." She pointed toward a chain-link fence, about 50 yards from where we stood. "Everything beyond that, including this pond area, belongs to the HOA common area." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stared at her, then at the fence she'd indicated. That fence had been there since I was 12 years old. Dad had put it up to keep the cattle in the north pasture. Beyond it lay another 100 acres of Sullivan land, including the pond, the old oak tree, where my grandfather had proposed to my grandmother, and the small cemetery where 4 generations of my family rested. That's impossible. This pond has been on Sullivan land since before there was a Whispering Pines HOA, before there was a Whispering Pines period. Karen's smile was razor-thin and twice as cutting. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. Mr. Sullivan, we have all the proper documentation. Your property ends at that fence line. Everything else reverted to HOA control when your father failed to pay his association dues before his death." The words hit me like a physical blow. Dad. Failing to pay dues. Dad. Who'd balanced his checkbook every Sunday after church. Who'd never missed a property tax payment in his life. Who'd taught me that a man's word and his obligations were sacred. It was impossible. Officer Johnson approached, his expression grave. "Mr. Sullivan, do you have documentation proving ownership of this area?" My mouth went dry. The property documents were in Dad's old desk back at the house, but I knew them by heart. Every survey, every deed, every tax record showed the Sullivan property extending all the way to Creekside Road, nearly 2 miles from where we stood. "Of course I do. But they're back at the house. This is insane. You're telling me I can't barbecue on land my family has owned for 70 years. Karen stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume mixed with something else. Something that smelled like corruption and lies. Mr. Sullivan, perhaps we can resolve this amicably. The Whispering Pines HOA is always willing to work with former residents. We might be able to arrange a special permit for you to use this common area occasionally, for a reasonable fee. Of course. Former residents. The phrase echoed in my head like a death knell. This woman was talking about my ancestral home, like I was some squatter who'd overstayed his welcome. Officer Martinez was studying Karen's documents, his brow furrowed. These papers look official, but property disputes like this usually require civil court resolution. Mr. Sullivan, I'd recommend you gather your documentation and contact a lawyer. In the meantime, Karen interjected smoothly, he needs to cease this illegal activity immediately. I looked at my father's pond, where golden light from the setting sun painted the water in shades of memory. This was where I'd planned to scatter more of his ashes tonight, where I'd intended to share one last beer with his spirit and tell him about the promotion I'd gotten at the engineering firm. Instead, I was being treated like a criminal for existing on my own land. Fine. I'll put out the grill. But this isn't over. Mrs. Pemberton. Not by a long shot. As I doused the charcoal with water, sending up a hiss of steam and smoke, Karen's smile broadened. I'm sure we can work something out. Mr. Sullivan. The HOA is always reasonable with cooperative residents. The police left with warnings and business cards. Karen lingered, examining my property with the acquisitive gaze of a predator sizing up territory. You know, this would make excellent community space. Perhaps a playground, or a community garden. The board has been discussing expansion of our recreational facilities. She walked away, her white tennis shoes somehow managing to stay pristine despite the dusty ground. I stood alone beside the cooling grill, watching her disappear into the gathering darkness, and felt something cold and determined settle in my chest. The next morning, I sat in Dad's old leather chair, surrounded by boxes of documents I'd pulled from every filing cabinet, safe, and storage area in the house. Deeds dating back to 1952, survey maps, tax records, insurance policies. Everything painted the same clear picture the Sullivan family owned, 247 acres extending from the original homestead all the way to Creekside Road. But something nagged at me. Dad had been meticulous about paperwork, but in his final months, the cancer treatments had left him confused and weak. What if something had slipped through the cracks? What if, in his illness, he'd missed some crucial deadline or payment? I called my friend Jake Morrison, who'd taken over his father's law practice in town. We'd grown up together, fishing in that same pond where Karen claimed I had no right to exist. Mav, slow down. You're telling me the HOA claims to own your dad's pond. Not just the pond. Everything from that north fence line to Creekside Road. 100 acres. Jake. They're saying Dad defaulted on some HOA dues before he died. Silence stretched across the phone line. When Jake spoke again, his voice had shifted into lawyer mode. That's unusual. HOAs can't just claim property for unpaid dues. There's a whole legal process. Liens, foreclosure proceedings, court orders. And even then, they'd typically auction the property, not just absorb it into common areas. So, you're saying they're lying. I'm saying something doesn't add up. Bring me everything you've got. Deeds, tax records, any correspondence from the HOA. And Mav, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And don't let them intimidate you into giving up your rights. As I gathered the documents, my phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Sullivan. This is Marcus Webb, president of the Whispering Pines HOA board. I believe you had an encounter with our compliance officer yesterday evening. His voice was smooth, professional, with the kind of calculated friendliness that made my skin crawl. Your compliance officer. Is that what you call someone who makes false claims about property ownership? Webb chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Mr. Sullivan, I understand this situation might be confusing for you. Grief can make things seem unclear. But I assure you, our documentation is thorough and legally sound. Your father's property reverted to HOA control 6 months ago when his account fell into default. My father never defaulted on anything in his life. I'm afraid the records show otherwise. However, as I mentioned to Mrs. Pemberton, we're reasonable people. We'd be willing to negotiate a lease agreement that would allow you continued access to certain areas for appropriate compensation. Appropriate compensation for access to my own family's land. What kind of compensation are we talking about? Well, given the prime nature of the waterfront property and the recent development interest in the area, I'd say a fair lease rate would be around $8,000 monthly. $8,000 monthly to access the pond where my father's ashes rested. You're out of your mind. Mr. Sullivan, please consider the alternative. Legal proceedings can be expensive and time-consuming, and I'm afraid if this matter goes to court, we'll be forced to seek damages for your unauthorized use of HOA property. That could become quite costly. The threat was clear: pay up or face financial ruin. I'll see you in court, Mr. Webb. I hung up, my hands shaking with rage. These people weren't just claiming my land. They were trying to extort me for the privilege of visiting my father's final resting place. That afternoon, I drove to Jake's office with a banker's box full of documents. Main Street looked the same as it had when Dad and I used to come to town for supplies. But something felt different. Darker. Like shadows had crept into familiar places and made themselves at home. Jake's office was in the same building where his father had practiced law for 40 years. The same building where my grandfather had signed the original deed to expand our property in 1967. History seemed to press down on us as Jake spread my documents across his conference table. This is interesting. Very interesting. Jake held up a survey map from 1995. Look at this property line. It clearly shows your land extending to Creekside Road. That's what I keep telling them. But look at this. He pulled out another document. This is a deed amendment filed 6 months ago. It shows the same property boundaries, but with a notation that the eastern section has been transferred to, let me see, Whispering Pines Community Development Corporation. My blood went cold. What does that mean? It means someone filed paperwork claiming your father transferred that land to them. But Mav, look at the signature. He slid the document across the table. The signature read, William Sullivan, in shaky handwriting that looked nothing like my father's firm. Precise script. That's not Dad's signature. I know. I've seen your father's signature on dozens of documents over the years. This isn't even close. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Mav, I think someone forged your father's signature and fraudulently transferred your property. This is bigger than an HOA dispute. This is criminal fraud. The room seemed to spin around me. Not only were they stealing my land, but they'd done it by forging my dying father's name. The violation felt personal, in a way that made my chest tight with fury. What do we do? Well, first, we file for an emergency injunction to stop any further development or use of the disputed property. Second, we demand a full investigation into the validity of this deed transfer. And third, Jake's smile was predatory. We go hunting for whoever did this. The emergency injunction hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. By Wednesday evening, I had my answer about how deep this conspiracy ran. Jake had hired a private investigator who'd uncovered a paper trail that led straight into the heart of a multi-million-dollar land grab scheme. Whispering Pines Community Development Corporation wasn't just the HOA. It was a shell company controlled by Marcus Webb and 2 city council members. Over the past 3 years, they'd acquired over 500 acres of prime development land through questionable means. Elderly property owners who'd missed tax payments, families dealing with medical emergencies, properties with unclear title issues, and in every case, the land had been absorbed into HOA common areas until development permits could be secured. Then, it was sold to Webb's construction company for pennies on the dollar. My father's land wasn't just valuable for its water access. It was the keystone piece needed to complete a 50-acre development project worth $15 million. I was reading through the investigator's report when someone knocked on my front door. Through the window, I could see Karen Pemberton standing on my porch, but she wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits flanked her, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I opened the door without invitation for them to enter. "Mr. Sullivan, we need to discuss your situation." Karen's voice was different now, less imperious, more businesslike. Behind her, the 2 men maintained the neutral expressions of people accustomed to delivering bad news. "I don't think we have anything to discuss. Mrs. Pemberton. Please, may we come in? This concerns your legal situation, and it would be better to resolve this privately." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. They filed into my living room like vultures entering a feeding ground. The older of the 2 men pulled out a leather portfolio. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Robert Chen, legal counsel for Whispering Pines Development. We understand you're planning to challenge the property transfer in court." "That's right. We'd like to offer you a settlement that would avoid lengthy and expensive litigation." He slid a check across my coffee table. The amount made my vision blur. $1.5 million. This is a generous offer for what amounts to unused pasture land. You could purchase a lovely home anywhere in the state and still have substantial funds remaining. I stared at the check, then at the 3 faces watching me with predatory intensity. "You're offering me money for land you claim to already own." Chen's smile was paper-thin. "We're offering you compensation to avoid the unpleasantness of a legal battle you're unlikely to win. Property law can be complex, and challenges to properly executed transfers rarely succeed." "Properly executed? You mean the forged signature on the deed transfer?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Karen's face went pale, and the second man shifted uncomfortably. Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I'm not sure what you're implying. Mr. Sullivan, all our documentation is legitimate and properly notarized. By a notary who died 3 months before the document was supposedly signed." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen looked like she might be sick. The younger man was openly staring at Chen, whose composure had finally cracked. "Mr. Sullivan, I think there may be some confusion." "Get out." My voice was quiet, but something in my tone made all 3 of them step backward. "Get out of my house. Get off my property. And tell Marcus Webb that if he wants my land, he can try to take it from me in court, under oath." They left quickly, but Karen lingered at the door. "Mr. Sullivan, please reconsider. You don't understand what you're getting into. These are powerful people with substantial resources." "Is that a threat? Mrs. Pemberton?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment she looked less like an imperious HOA enforcer and more like a frightened woman who'd gotten in over her head. "It's a warning. From someone who thought she was just helping her community maintain property values." Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October wind that cuts through clothing and settles in your bones. The courthouse was packed with reporters, neighbors, and what looked like half the Whispering Pines HOA board. Word had gotten out about the fraud allegations, and the local news stations were treating it like the story of the year. Marcus Webb sat at the defendant's table with 3 lawyers, all of them radiating the kind of expensive confidence that money can buy. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and his silver hair was perfectly styled. When he saw me enter the courtroom, his smile was pure predator. Judge Patricia Hernandez took the bench at exactly 9 o'clock. She was known for running a tight courtroom and having zero tolerance for legal shenanigans. Jake had warned me that she'd want facts, not emotions. But as I looked at Webb's smug face, emotion was all I had. This is an emergency hearing to determine the validity of a property transfer and to rule on a motion for temporary injunction. Mr. Morrison, you represent the plaintiff. Yes, Your Honor. We're seeking an injunction to prevent further development or alteration of property that was fraudulently transferred from my client's family. Webb's lead attorney, a shark in a $1,000 suit named Davidson, rose immediately. Your Honor, these are serious allegations without foundation. The property transfer was properly executed and legally binding. Mr. Sullivan is attempting to overturn a legitimate transaction simply because he disagrees with his late father's decision. Judge Hernandez studied the documents both sides had submitted. Mr. Morrison, your evidence for fraud. Jake approached the bench with a folder thick with documents. Your Honor, the signature on the deed transfer doesn't match any known samples of William Sullivan's signature. Furthermore, the notary listed on the document died 3 months before the supposed signing date. We also have evidence that the defendant company has engaged in a pattern of similar questionable acquisitions. Davidson objected immediately. Speculation and hearsay. Your Honor, handwriting analysis is subjective, and notary errors happen. The defendant company's other transactions are irrelevant to this case. Judge Hernandez looked between the 2 lawyers, then directly at me. Mr. Sullivan, this is your family's property we're discussing. Yes, Your Honor. My great-grandfather built our ranch on that land in 1952. My father lived there his entire life and died there 6 months ago. The idea that he would sign away our family cemetery and the pond where we scattered his ashes is absurd. Something shifted in the judge's expression. She'd been looking at legal documents, but now she was seeing the human cost. Mr. Davidson, your client's response to the handwriting analysis. Davidson consulted with Webb in urgent whispers before responding. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan was terminally ill and undergoing chemotherapy. It's well documented that such treatments can affect motor control and handwriting. The signature, while different, reflects his medical condition at the time. It was a good argument. Reasonable doubt wrapped in medical justification. But Jake was ready. Your Honor, we'd like to call an expert witness, Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic handwriting analyst with 30 years of experience. Dr. Chen took the stand with the confidence of someone who'd testified in hundreds of cases. She was small, precise, and utterly devastating. I've examined over 200 samples of William Sullivan's signature spanning 40 years. The signature on the contested document shows none of the characteristic tremor patterns typical of chemotherapy patients. Instead, it shows clear evidence of simulation, someone attempting to copy an unfamiliar signature. She pulled out enlarged photographs of signature comparisons. Note the hesitation marks here. And here. The pen lifts in places where Mr. Sullivan's authentic signatures show continuous flow. This is classic evidence of forgery. Davidson tried to poke holes in her analysis, but Dr. Chen was unshakable. When he sat down, perspiration was visible on his forehead. Jake stood for his final argument. Your Honor, this isn't just about one forged signature. It's about a systematic scheme to defraud elderly and vulnerable property owners. My client's family has been violated in the most fundamental way possible. Their very identity tied to this land has been stolen through criminal fraud. He gestured toward Webb, whose composure was finally starting to crack. The defendants thought they could exploit a grieving son's trust in the legal system. They were wrong. Judge Hernandez didn't deliberate long. Based on the evidence presented, I find clear and convincing proof that the deed transfer was fraudulent. The temporary injunction is granted. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. HOA board members sat in stunned silence, and Marcus Webb's carefully constructed mask of respectability finally shattered completely. This is a travesty. That land is worthless without development. We're trying to improve the community. His lawyers tried to quiet him, but the dam had burst. Do you know how much tax revenue this project would generate? How many jobs? These people don't understand progress. Judge Hernandez's gavel cracked like thunder. Mr. Webb, you will control yourself in my courtroom, or be held in contempt. But Webb was beyond control now, his face red with rage and desperation. That old man was going to die anyway. The land was just sitting there, unused. We gave it purpose. The courtroom fell dead silent. Webb's lawyers looked like they wanted to disappear. Karen Pemberton, sitting in the gallery, had her face buried in her hands. Judge Hernandez turned to the court reporter. Please ensure that Mr. Webb's statements are included in the transcript forwarded to the district attorney. 6 months later, I stood by my father's pond as the sun set on the longest day of the year. The water reflected the orange and pink sky like a mirror, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the cattle lowing as they moved toward the barn for evening feeding. Marcus Webb was serving 18 months in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. 2 city council members had resigned in disgrace. The Whispering Pines HOA had been dissolved, and its assets distributed back to the homeowners who'd been systematically bilked over the years. Karen Pemberton had testified for the prosecution in exchange for immunity. Turned out she'd been as much a victim as anyone else, manipulated by Webb's promises of community improvement and higher property values. She'd moved to Arizona to live with her sister, leaving behind the wreckage of her suburban dreams. The development project had been permanently halted. The 500 acres of stolen land had been returned to their rightful owners, or their heirs. 3 families had recovered ancestral property they'd thought was lost forever. But the real victory was quieter, more personal. I'd honor my father's memory by protecting what he'd built, what his father had built, what his grandfather had built with sweat and determination and an unshakable belief that a man's legacy lived in the land he loved. I raised a beer toward the darkening sky. We did it, Dad. The land stays in the family. A gentle breeze rippled across the pond, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and fresh grass. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate, and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue above. Tomorrow, I'd start building the workshop Dad had always planned to construct by the water's edge. Next month, I'd plant the memorial garden my grandmother had sketched in her journals. Next year, maybe I'd finally find someone to share all this beauty with. Someone who understood that some things are worth fighting for. But tonight, I just stood by the water and felt the weight of generations settling around my shoulders like a comfortable blanket. This was home. This was family. This was the land that made us who we were. And no amount of money or legal maneuvering could ever change that fundamental truth. The pond reflected the emerging stars, and in that reflection, I could see the faces of everyone who'd stood on this shore before me. My great-grandfather, who dug this pond with his own hands during the drought of '58. My grandfather, who taught my father to fish from these banks. My father, who taught me. And someday, God willing, I'd teach my own children to cast a line into these waters, to understand the weight of legacy and the price of protecting what matters most. The Whispering Pines development was dead, but the Sullivan Ranch would endure, protected by law and love and the unbreakable bonds that tie a family to the land that shaped them. That night, as I walked back toward the house where 4 generations of my family had been born, I could swear I heard my father's voice carried on the evening wind. "Well done, son. Well done." And for the first time since his death, I felt truly at peace.